Good afternoon. It's a great privilege to be here today. I want to thank Ooty Literature Festival. Yeah, is that better? Yeah. So I was thinking of a connection between the session I was on and this. That one was on conservation. I decided that we all three belong to an endangered species, the historian. History stopped being taught in many universities in southern India. People used to say, history enthuk padikirudhu. Vale kadakade. Vanda, engineering padla. So there was this notion that history is past its peak. The other, of course, is that I work in a university, and you'll forgive me for saying that I don't think the university is endangered as an entity, but sometimes you feel the university as a place is endangered as a space. This is irrespective of who's in power. I'm really struck by the title because it talks about history and the wonder that was India, and we couldn't have two better people with us. Anirudh Kanisetti has done an enormous amount to bring the Deccan to light and give us a view of Indian history which doesn't privilege, the Indo-Ganga Brahmaputra plain. More Ganga than Indus and hardly any Brahmaputra, for those who came in late. A.R. Venkatachalapathy needs no introduction in Tamil Nadu, but I do emphasize he's one of the foremost historians of our time on the emergence of the book, on the emergence of the reading public, on the emergence of the public space. So I'd like to begin with a very simple question. When you look at a title, The Wonder That was India so wonderful? And how do you see your work beyond the notion of the wonder that was India? Are you trying to tell us something more about the past than such a title indicates? With all respect to A.L. Basham, who wrote this remarkable book in the 50s, it's still worth reading. Basham was, of course, a great Sanskritist. And it has a very particular view of India, which was fine in that time and space. So would you like to begin, Anirudh?
Thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Rangarajan. Thank you to the Ooty Lit Fest. It's an honor to be here and to be sharing the stage with such distinguished and senior scholars. I have to say before I begin that a journalist friend of mine, Ayushi, who's actually here, was telling me yesterday night that apparently a lot of very distinguished folks have been looking forward to seeing my session. So thank you all, first of all, for the vote of confidence, and I have to say that I'm extremely nervous to be addressing all of you today. But to answer a very, very thoughtful question, Mahesh, I feel like there has always been this, at least as far as Dr. Chalapathy can answer this better than I can, of course, but through the course of the 20th century, there has been, partially as a result of our independence movement, there has been a tendency to want to glorify our past and to see in it this kind of idealized world that comforts us in very discomforting and volatile times. You can see it in many of the regional nationalist movements that emerge across southern India especially, but also in our broader view of how we think about India's history. So I grew up studying the ICSE syllabus, and the way that history was taught to me was this parade essentially of these great nationalist icons, these great kings who ruled over an India that was this land of milk and honey essentially, but that was then despoiled by foreign invaders, in my case the British, though of course that is changing under current political regimes. But I think both of these reveal a fundamental flaw in the way that we think about the past, in that we think that the past is there to comfort us rather than to make us question who we are and where we come from. And I think that that is a problem, because the second that the past begins to exist only as a place that you can draw comfort from, it no longer exists as its own entity, but only as a pale reflection of our own anxieties. And that's very, very clear, I think, especially in today's politics, in the kind of world that we're living in, where there is this concerted effort to make India, before 1000 CE or so, appear to be an extraordinary land ruled by great and devout kings who are building these magnificent temples. But in my study of the period, as I look at the epigraphy, as I look at the inscriptions these kings were making, what's really striking to me is that these are very, very far from our conception of what an ideal ruler is. These are men who are completely unashamed about their use of violence. These are also men who are very proud about their bodies, and who are proud of their sexuality in a way that seems very alien to our minds that are so used to British and post-British notions of morality. But much more than that, moving beyond the folks building the temples, there are almost no traces of the folks in the farms, the people wielding the plows, the people the people who are weaving the extraordinary textiles that are one of the richest aspects of our heritage, the people who are making the sculptures. Where are their histories? Where do they fit into the wonder that was India? And the answer is, the further you look, and the more you try to look at the archaeology, the more you try to fill in the blanks of history as it was, you begin to realize that India was not really such a wonderful place after all. And in a lot of ways, saying that India was a wonder obscures the fact that very often it wasn't for most people, and continues not to be a wonder for many of our fellow citizens today.
Thank you. Chalo.
First, let me thank the organizers, and very privileged to be with Mahesh Rangarajan, who is a senior historian, and the other very heartening thing is that, when I started to write, this was in the early 80s, I started writing in Tamil. There was no space for history writing. Students who failed in everything, who could not even get into Tamil literature, those were the students who went into history. From that time, now I find, bright young men, bright young women studying in the best institutions taking up history. So that first is very, very heartening. When I started writing in the 80s, I didn't know for whom I was writing. Now I find not a month passes when some young person, young girl, young student, young man coming and saying, I read your book. One person said, no, I feel for the last 1 week, I feel as though I've been possessed. So this shift is very, very heartening, and the future is very, very bright, even though, as Mahesh indicated at the beginning, we are under enormous strain, enormous constraints. We always feel somebody is breathing down our neck, looking from over our shoulders. So that's it. To say, when the allusion is obviously to A.L. Basham's great book, but that book is actually a very rich book, despite the very misleading title. It is a very rich book because he wanted non-Indians to read about India. And it was not like, the old histories. Somebody joked that, Indian history for a long time looked like the New York telephone directory. It had just names and numbers. And that is the best way to kill any interest in history. So the point about first is, history is very, very interesting. And I think in our own ways, we have tried to make it interesting in our work. That said, how wonderful was our past, or our nation, or our country, or our territory? I would say, Walter Benjamin says somewhere that, every document of civilization is also a document of barbarity. You have a Taj Mahal, you have a big temple. God knows how many people, gave their lives for it. So when I went to Angkor Wat, the first thing that struck me was, of course there is pride. You look at the Angkor Wat temples. Even somebody who has grown up in Tamil Nadu, where if you go to Kanchipuram or Tanjavur, தடிக்கு விழுந்தா கோயில்ல விழுவோன்னு சொல்லுவாங்க. இந்த ரெண்டு ஊர்லயும் தடுக்கிறதே கோயில்ல தான். Now you will trip only on a temple. But even for somebody from Tamil Nadu, Angkor Wat is incredible. But at the same time, there is an underlying question. How were these temples built? How was labor extracted? What was the surplus that sustained all these institutions, big institutions? Where are the voices of these people? Let me give you one very specific example. I don't want to, I'm not very greedy. As an Indian historian, I am very, very conservative in terms of, what to expect. So I'm not expecting to hear the voice of the laborer who was working to build the big temple. Just take something that happened in 1908 in Tirunelveli. Chidambaram Pillai was arrested, and then the next day there was a massive popular protest. The entire town of Tirunelveli and Tuticorin went up in flames. There was police firing, 5 people died, hundreds of people were arrested. Some of them were given summary justice, including being caned. But 115 years later, we have the voice of the collectors, we have the voice of the superintendent of police, we have the voice of the constables. I have not been able to find even one line from any of the protesters. So what we have to do is constantly, the pressure for an Indian historian is to constantly look for, read the documents against the grain. Where are the voices? Who are these people? I couldn't find the names of the people who were shot dead. And let me end with one more instance. This is comes from the great scholar, Gandhi scholar, Tridip Shruth. You know, Tridip Shruth is somebody I respect a lot because he does the most unsexy type of research. He is preparing concordance of Gandhi's autobiography, the difference between the first and the second edition, and then he prepares a critical edition of Experiments with Truth. It's all a labor of love. He gave me some instance of, say, in 1917, about the time of the Champaran Satyagraha, Gandhi assigned Rajendra Prasad and others to collect the testimony of the peasants, of the farmers. And Tridip says that, 7,000 pages of the testimony of peasants have been retrieved and now he is publishing them. And what he told me really shocked me is that in the entire history of humankind, this is the first instance where we hear the peasant talking in his or her own voice. This is the challenge, to writing about kings, about princes, about palace intrigues. It might have its uses, but we really, really need to go beyond that. And I think that is the challenge. And the moment you start writing about that, people will get interested in history.
So Brecht wrote a famous poem, Questions of a Worker Who Reads. And it had a remarkable line which even as a 10, 12-year-old captured your imagination. It said, Caesar conquered Gaul. Caesar conquered Gaul. Had he not even a cook with him? Where did the workers go to sleep when they finished their day's work building the Great Wall of China? So I want to ask you, Anirudh, where did the workers go to sleep after they'd finished building for the day the Great Wall of China? So Caesar conquered Gaul, had he not even a cook with him. So I was just wondering, one of the great inspiring books was written by someone who never held a university job, had an uncanny similarity to someone who's influenced everyone in this room, who's particularly all the young, and including those who want to remain young, J.K. Rowling. J.K. Rowling wrote her first novel, much of it in a coffee shop with heating. So did Sheila Rowbotham 50 years before. And Sheila Rowbotham wrote an incredible book called Hidden from History. It's about women's voices, a very important book. And you wonder whether that book should have, with the greatest respect to Dr. Rowbotham, should have been called Hidden by History. So I had a question for you, Anirudh, which is that, when you're looking at the 20th century, all these documents on Champaran, nationalists going out, putting petitions together, and there's similar work on Jallianwala Bagh by Professor B.N. Datta, whom we lost just 2 years ago. When you look at earlier periods of history, how do we find, the evidence of the cook or the laborer? I'm saying this particularly because I'm stuck in your book by how many of the rulers you describe had what would be called humble origins from not such exalted professions. So would you like to talk a little about it? Because it's something fascinating in your book.
This is once again, a really interesting question. And The answer really lies in what Dr. Chalapathy is saying in terms of reading the sources against the grain. Um, sorry. There's this extraordinary inscription that I've come across from Tiruvattiur in near Chennai. So there's a beautiful temple of Shiva there. Really, I think it's over 1200 years old. And there's an inscription there by a man who was this dreadlocked Shiva saint. And it's an endowment of gold for the temple. And he also leaves these little details that have made it possible for historians to trace out exactly who he was. This Shiva saint, who is not a saint, basically the head of a monastery, who's making this donation, used to be a Chola general. And the reason why he's ended up at that particular temple is because a couple of decades before, he was fighting on a battlefield alongside a Chola prince. This Chola prince was killed on the battlefield. He was blamed, the general seems to have been blamed for the defeat, and eventually basically gave up his position and left the Chola court, wandered North India as an ascetic, comes back to Tamil Nadu, and then becomes an ascetic. He gives up the world, he gives up this glamorous world of the court that holds so much attraction to us today. He gives all of that up. And to me, while all this is fascinating, because it's so rare to see like a medieval life with its highs and lows that are so different from us. Can you imagine losing your friend and companion on the battlefield, being blamed by his family, deciding that you can only regain your honor by giving up your life of glamour and then walking across the subcontinent? It's just extraordinary to think about. But to me, what's most interesting is that this whole thing where he talks about his former life only takes up 2 lines in this inscription, in the narration that he makes. The majority of the donation is actually talking about the number of cooks that need to be hired, the number of sweepers who need to be hired to take care of the temple. And there is something so incredibly poignant and touching in that, because not only is it a moment of catharsis perhaps for this man who emerges onto the historical stage for the last time. We have no records of what happened to him after that. But he's not so concerned with the court as he is with making sure that his grant is well taken care of, and the people who are going to be paid by the grant are making sure that things are going to run properly after that. But even beyond that, it's not just the literature, right? You have to remember that most of the little people didn't know how to write. The fact that I'm a great grandson of farmers. The fact that I'm here able to speak to you all in English is extraordinary. My ancestors would probably be very proud of the fact that I'm here speaking English, writing English. But this was the case for most Indians who come from my social class, my caste, throughout time. They would not have been able to make their voices heard, to make their voices be remembered. So you have to look for their traces in very, very different kinds of ways. And there's this very interesting example I've come across from the big temple in Tanjore. It appears that the temple wasn't actually run according to schedule, which I find very interesting, because it was a colossal management project in its time, you can imagine. And it was rushed to completion to make sure that it was done by the 275th day of the 25th year of Rajaraja. Because the number 5 has considerable significance in Shaiva Siddhanta, which Rajaraja was an adherent of. And even if the temple wasn't going to be perfectly done by then, he wanted it to be finished. That in itself is very interesting, because you realize that the managers of the temple construction project then had to cut a lot of corners to make sure it was done on time. If you were to look at the sculptural niches on the temple, you'll see there's these projecting square blocks that were intended to be carved into smaller gods that accompany the main god in the sculpture. And a lot of them weren't finished. So on the entire upper story of the temple, the ones that weren't finished were just cut down, smoothened out. And you can see them there today. It doesn't register but once you actually see, you can see the project was rushed. But really the most interesting example of this comes from a Vishnu temple, which is on the Vishnu sculpture on the main hall. And there you can see that 2 different people were given 2 different blocks to carve out. And both of them had very different approaches to sculpture. So the first person first carved out the entire outline of the sculpture he was going to finish, but then left it there because the project was brought to a close. The other person started to carve almost fully in the round, but then never finished the entire sculpture because, the project was wrapped up. But what happened to them after that? We don't know their names, we don't know where we can find their fingerprints on the rock of history, as it were. And we don't even know how much they were getting paid, or whether the next employer they had paid them as much as Rajaraja Chola might have or might not have, as the case may be. So you really have to be very, very careful. But once you open your eyes to them, the little people are everywhere, just as they are in our own history today. We were so used to thinking of history as made by the great people, by the Roosevelts and the Nehrus of the world, but it's equally made by the soldiers who are fighting and dying in the most horrific ways on these battlefields. It's equally made by the people going out there mobilizing folks to go and vote for whichever political candidate. So as I said, just to reiterate, the more you look, the more you see that history is not a project of the big people. History has been and is being written by the little people, as we see.
Anirudh works on the pre-modern period. I work on the modern period. But sometimes I wonder if you are luckier with your sources, because even though I'm a book historian, I was wondering, if only we had not invented paper, our forebears would have left behind their records in stone inscriptions, and they would have survived. Because stones can survive not only floods, big climatic events, but it also can survive apathy and indifference. Paper cannot survive apathy and indifference, which is what we specialize in. So we have bought something like 50,000-60,000 Chola inscriptions. But to find material about just 3 generations ago, only because they were committed to paper, to finding them, is such a big challenge, and that comes in the way of writing history. So let me give you a small story from a book that I published last year. It was called, The Brief History of a Very Big Book. It was a brief history because after 25 years, the material that I could collect, I could write only a brief history. It is about the making of the Tamil Encyclopedia. 10 volumes, 7,500 words, 7,500 pages. It was one of the great achievements in the post-independence period. When I was working on that, the history of that encyclopedia, I had to go back a little and give me a few minutes to narrate this story. In the 1920s, there was one person called T.V. Sambasivam Pillai. He was a police, he worked in the police department. From what we know, he was barely a matriculate. He suddenly starts a huge project. What is the project? He is planning to compile a dictionary of medical terms in Tamil. But what he ends up doing is not a dictionary, but it actually ends up as an encyclopedia. And it runs to 4,000 pages. And it doesn't stop with medicine, because in Indian epistemological tradition, everything is interlinked. So medicine, the sciences, astrology, astronomy, everything together. He starts collecting material, and then he starts publishing these volumes. The first volume is published in the mid-1930s. He completes only 1.5 volumes. He has taken some loan from the government of Madras. And then after 20 years, what happens is, without completing the printing of the book, he dies. The Tahsildar comes and attaches his property, takes away all the printed forms and the manuscript, and they are dumped in the Madras Collectorate office. 20 years later, that is after 15 years after this man's death, one savant, the great publisher, V. Subbaya Pillai of Saivisatanda Nurpadipu Kadagam, he gets wind of this. He said, yes, we have seen this one volume of this great dictionary and encyclopedia, Now I hear that this is somewhere, let us go and find out. So he uses his influence. And then he goes to the collectorate, and he, in that jumble and in all these things, he actually manages to locate not only the unbound forms, but also the manuscript. It is something like 4,000 pages, and he looks at it closely. The headwords are in Tamil, and it is accompanied by descriptions both in Tamil and in English. And the interesting thing is, his English is, the Tamil description is amazing. How he classifies, how he, divides and sums up and aggregates the various concepts is amazing. But the next thing is how he describes it in English, in the most precise language. So I'll give you an example. There is supposed to be one particular herb, which if you step your foot on it, you will lose your sense for a while. So there is a phrase in Tamil, திகை பூண்டு மெதித்தார் போல். அந்த பூண்டை மெதிச்சா உங்களுக்கு திகைப்பு வரும். So the Tamil lexicon describes that state of mind as bewilderment. But this man, he calls it stupefaction. Such nuance. Single-handedly he has done this. Okay, and then there is a long story which I narrate. It takes another 20 years to completely publish this 6 volumes of this encyclopedic dictionary. But now I come to the central point. So somebody achieves this. Who the hell is this man? Where was he born? Where was he educated? How did he manage to get this kind of information? And he writes a long preface. One of the lucky things that happens in this particular case is, usually the prefaces and acknowledgements are written at the end of the book. After you have finished your book, you write it. Or if there are PhD students, we all know that the introduction will be the last that you write. After you have finished your thesis, you say that this is what I set out to do. So the same thing, this is a sleight of hand. But luckily,
you're letting out all our trade secrets. But that's
yes.
It's out already, so we can't censor.
I'm trying to see if we can recruit more people for our profession. Okay, to come to the end of this story, of all this long story of tragedies, the only bright spot is that, this man decided to write the preface for the first volume itself. If he had waited for the last volume to be published, it would have happened only 3 generations later. So he writes this long preface, running into something like 120 pages. It is no ordinary preface. It is actually an exegesis in Tamil Indian epistemological traditions. It is not about medicine. It is about cosmology, how you see the world, how the world is structured, how you collect material, and his very deep sense of the times in which he lives. He says the biggest challenge to Indian medicine has been the passing of the Indian Poisons Act by the colonial government. So we have these kind of achievements, but we don't know nothing. We have only one surviving photograph. Because when they confiscated all the papers, his ID card was also confiscated. So all we have is one photograph, no information on what are the intellectual sources from which a great achievement like this comes. So, as I say, this is a wonder. This production of this encyclopedia is a wonder. But the barbarity of this, the other side is we don't know anything about these things. And this is the challenge that we have to face all the time. This is for a literate person. What about those illiterate millions? What do we know about the people who went and burnt the Chauri Chaura police station? You need to have a Shahid Amin come and, unearth all these things. But still, we don't hear the voice.
One of the things which strikes me, listening to both of you, is that You know, Netflix right now is having a Vishal Bharadwaj serial, which is based on one of the lesser-known Agatha Christie characters. And one of the things about Agatha Christie characters is the detective has to assess what happened on the basis of accidentally surviving evidence. The evidence is not laid out. The evidence is there. And you know, in the last few pages of the detective novel, you say, hey, I should have figured that out. And of course you couldn't, because you're not Hercule Poirot or whoever it is. So I think one of the problems is that how one reads the evidence also depends on how one looks at it. So I was just thinking, you know, since I did refer to the 70s, you know, in the late 70s, there was an extraordinary film based, as many Indian films are, on a Western novel, Eric Siegel, Man, Woman and Child, Masoom. You must have seen the film.
Olangal in Malayalam.
Every kid I know knows the song. I made the mistake 2-3 times of trying it on a 3-4-year-old. They not only started singing it, they kept singing it 5, 10, 15, 20 times. And you know, the first words are memorable. Lakdi ki kati, kati pe ghoda. Ghode ke dum pe jo mara hathoda. It's about a rocking horse. But most people miss this line in the song, which always piques my interest. घोड़ा अपना तगड़ा है, देखो कैसी चर्बी है, चढ़ता है मेहरौली में, पर घोड़ा अपना अरबी है. So I'll translate. Look at our horse, how sleek and glossy he is. He grazes in the fields of Mehroli, then on the outskirts of Delhi, but he is a truly Arab horse. You know, Gulzar Saab is someone deeply rooted in history, in Farsi, in Punjabi, in Hindi, in Urdu. And what he's stumbling onto is so important. In the 70s, we get Simon Digby, Thomas Troutman telling us that in Indian history, one of the defining features of military power was horses. And there's a problem with horses. They're like the best cars you have. They were all imported. The best horses were Arabi, Turki, Turani, Irani, and they came through 2 routes. They trotted through the famous passes of Khyber and Golan, or they came, as you know, Anirudh, over the sea. And this is a very important point in terms of trade, because they are paid for, particularly after the 16th century, in silver. Sometime in the 1830s, there are Afghan wars and the horse road gets cut off, etc., etc. And as late as the mid-19th century, horses were critical to war. You know, there are the supply of horses. It's a very interesting work now by Shumit Guha, which reminds us horses are pretty difficult to maintain. So again, to go back to a Hindi film, since both of you referred to technology, temple building, printing, you know, one of Amitabh Bachchan's lesser-known films, I'm sorry, I'm brought up more in Hindi than Tamil cinema, so pardon me, is a famous film called Feetan. Feetan is, of course, the tanga, the horse-drawn cart. Extraordinary story of conflict of generations, as well as of technology. He rebels against his father, who's a judge, gives up the legal profession, decides to train in classical music, and works driving a tanga. The father then, of course, goes to court, gets tangas outlawed, and drives the tanga-walas out of job in the place. Now, the interesting thing is, Amitabh Bachchan, for the first time, realizes every day he has to earn enough to pay for himself and the horse. And the horse, he discovers, as anyone who's gone in a tanga would know, not only needs fodder, it needs chana. You see, it needs some really good fodder. So what Shumit Guha shows us is that in the long years that he studies, the new 500-year history, the supply of fodder imposes huge exactions in the countryside from armies. These armies actually take over fodder, and they are frightening when you read those. You know, go out, writes a Maratha commander, into an area of, 100 kilometers, whatever the equivalent is, and commander all the fodder you can find. Also bring all the men you can find for cooking, cleaning, etc. Because each horse, I'm now using Mughal era statistics, needs roughly 3 people to look after it. And of course, with the elephant, you need 5. So I think, when we think of power, one of the things with military power is it has a huge environmental impact. Yesterday Suprabha was raising informally, as soon as we finished, what's the cost of the environmental footprint of a warplane or a warship. But when we think of history, because you raised labor, a lot of these armies are also taking a huge surplus from the countryside. They're commanding fodder, they're commanding water, they're commanding food, and they're commanding labor. And I want to emphasize the labor part. You're dragged off and told you've got to work for an army for 3 weeks. You're not paid. Of course, they pay you enough to keep you. life and limb together, and then you go back. So I think there's something enormously significant in history that this accidentally surviving evidence, we bring it to light. So my question to you is slightly different, and I'm sorry, I'm going to inflict another silly parable on you, because you did say that we had to learn up all these names. You referred to the New York Times directory. You know, there was this awful limerick we sang, Ek tha Raja, ek thi Rani, dono mar gaye, khatam kahani. You just quickly cram the names of the rulers, and if it was a good ruler, you wrote that this person remitted taxes, they built roads, they built sarais, and they planted trees. And if it was bad, you said that they raised all the taxes. So why is this old history got such a grip on us? Because let's be very clear, as students in school, we knew who were the goodies and the baddies. The baddies were very bad, the goodies were very good. Now this would be nice if we laughed it off as, the whims of teachers and children, but a lot of public history, not only in this country, is now being reduced to this. So often you're asked, what do you work on? Nehru. What do you work on? The British. Are you making out a case against them? Are you telling us, was it really so bad or so good? So what is the role of the historian with this accidentally surviving evidence? Is it similar to Hercule Poirot, or is it different? Are you looking for, who did it or not? And if not, why not? I'm sorry, this seems, it may not be an important question for such an erudite audience, but believe me, we ask this all the time. Yeah, so, what is the difference between the role of the historian and that of the detective, beyond the way we weigh up evidence and come up with all these new insights? Would you like to go? Yeah, please.
What is the historian's role? I think it's twofold. One, I think fundamentally is that historians should tell a good story, in the sense that not fabricated, imagined, but in the sense of capturing the imagination of people, because we live by stories. If we didn't have stories, we wouldn't be able to make sense of ourselves, of who we are, what is our past, where we come from. So that is a fundamental duty. But of what do you make stories? That is, the one is we can go into the technical details, and I think very closely the modern practice of history, the craft of history, and the emergence of detective fiction run very parallelly. But the bigger question is of analysis. History is a process. It is not events. There might be events which show the spikes, but history is a process. And we have to understand causation. We have to understand how these events or processes unfold and where do they lead. And this is always a contingent story. We don't have a final answer to it. The questions that we asked 50 years ago are different. The answers we gave are different. Now we ask the questions in a different way and answer them in a different way. But it doesn't take away the valence of those earlier questions and early. That is the fundamental point. So I think we have to be very, very conscious of that in our urgency, or in the demand to meet the demand for good history, which I think is very important, because bad history comes when poor history is being written, and especially when academic historians, I blame academic historians for not trying to reach a larger audience, and not only that, to add insult to injury, they look down upon historians who try to write for a larger audience. One should have both the expertise of a Hobsbawm or a Hill or a E.P. Thompson, but at the same time write stories and to engage the larger audience. And when you do that, you ask questions. Don't get into history without questions. Ask good questions, even if you are not able to answer them. Look into causation, look into analysis, and at the end of it, I'm sure it is something that enriches not only the individual, it also enriches the society in which we live. That's how I would see it. And what a historian should never do is, the historian is not a hanging judge. The historian's job is not to sit on a high pedestal and deliver verdicts about, so-and-so was a villain, so-and-so was a hero, and so-and-so should have been beheaded and executed. That is not the job of the historian, because the historian is not competent to do all those things.
I'm not sure I could really add to that incredible answer. It's just so comprehensive. As Dr. Chalapathy was saying it, I was like, but what can I add to this? And by the end of it, there's really nothing more I can really say. But if I may be forgiven for slightly unparliamentary language, I'd like to share an experience from one of my readers. So for a while on Instagram, back during the pandemic, I used to run a meme page, because my idea is that history does not have to be confined necessarily to the book or to the academic journal. History is something that whether or not academia, whether or not educated public historians engage with, people will talk about it, people will write about it. And as Dr. Chalapathy said, it is so important to us to engage with that, because I think very clearly what we're seeing in India today in terms of the way we think about history, where history is something that must pass judgment, history is something that must confirm your biases, and if it doesn't do that, it's not history. That's something that's become so commonplace, partially I think because of the withdrawal of academic history from public circulation. And as a corollary of that story, I'd made a meme about the Nayakas of Tamil Nadu and the kind of poetry that they were interested in commissioning. So a lot of them happened to be of Telugu descent, happened to be very interested in courtly Telugu. And the meme basically poked fun of the fact that, they ended up inadvertently or intentionally leaving courtly Tamil a little bit by the wayside in terms of the patronage patterns. And I got a very angry comment from a young Tamil man who said, the Nayakas were aliens, so obviously they'll only patronize their culture, learn history before making comments, you Telugu idiot. And I was very struck by this comment because of this idea that has taken root that only a particular kind of person with a particular kind of lineage can or should be considered a valid historian. And I think that is a signal of a much broader societal problem, which it is not just the duty of the historian to solve, but also that of the reader to be open to ideas that are going to challenge them, to understand that history is an interconnected process that we are all participating in, and to not cancel or disagree with or outright dismiss histories or historians who don't agree with you. We are a land of extraordinary diversity in terms of all of our intertwined socioeconomic histories. There was a friend of mine is working on a children's book about the Mughals, and she told me this thing that has really, really stuck with me, because at the very beginning of the 1500s, apparently Babur and Humayun were in a situation where they were boiling horse meat in a helmet to eat out of. And just a few decades ago, the wife of the grandson of the last Mughal emperor, who's living in Kolkata, is penniless and has applied to the government for financial aid and was completely rejected. So my friend said, here's a family that has started out essentially from nothing, went all the way up to the top, and then went all the way down again. And if we were able to really look back at a lot of our family histories, we would see the same extraordinary rise and fall in fortunes. And that teaches us, if it's one thing that teaches us, it's not that we should be unkind or overly proud of the particular positions in which we find ourselves today, but rather that to understand that history is a story of us all, and at some point there will be winners and there will be losers. And the duty of us as historians and as society at large is to make sure that the losers are not treated unkindly and the winners are not overly valorized for who they are and where they happen to be.
No, I take college rivalries extremely seriously, unlike ethnic identities. And I went to Hindu college, not St. Stephen's. But I will say something nice about St. Stephen's. There's very eminent people from St. Stephen's in the audience, not because of that. At the centenary of St. Stephen's College, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was the guest. And she said something extraordinary. She said that when you look at Indian history, it is not the story of a melting pot. It's more like a salad bowl. And she said the extraordinary thing about salad bowl is that there are different kinds of vegetables and fruits sliced and put in. They together make the salad, but they have their distinctive flavor. And she could have been paraphrasing a much more learned member of her family, the great Jawaharlal Nehru, who, in the discovery of India, the original is around 1,200 pages. And I have to say this because of what you said about paper. It was written by a detenue. Paper was rationed. Time is also rationed, but that ration was stricter than our very kind organizer. So when you read, the drafts of that discovery of India, there are some cuts of words on the page. He couldn't slash the page and rewrite it. I want to emphasize it. We all write on laptops and cell phones and all. And the extraordinary thing about the discovery of India is not the history. Much of the history can and should be questioned. Lots of it is. It's written by a detenue. He gets into jail August 42. He gets out May 45. Why would you write a book on the discovery of India when you were in jail? Many reasons. One of them is that he says that India has a history where there have been many layers of people coming in. And no new layer, every new layer got added, but never managed to obliterate that which pre-existed it. This is a very profound insight. And I think it is up to us to test it, to validate it, to invalidate it, etc. But if someone sets out to tear it apart and disprove it without looking at the evidence, that is what we're staring at today. And I think this is not about the politics of X or Y, Mrs. Gandhi, who many things one can and should disagree with. Jawaharlal Nehru, maybe equally many things. But I think that one of the dilemmas of history is that, as you both said so nicely, your job is not to be the Red Queen and Alice in Wonderland, First the sentence, then the evidence. It's the evidence, and more evidence to tell a story. So hopefully, historians are here to tell stories. They're here because they live to tell stories. And stories are a thing, as you said, everybody lives by. And history is a particular kind of story. It gives us a sense of the past with a view to the future, but with some ideas of evidence, logic, and reason. We are not like Hercule Poirot. We won't tell you who did it. We certainly won't say the butler did it. But these are stories which have a sense of how to think more clearly about the future by drawing on the past. So thank you both very much, and thank you everyone in the audience.
Thank you.
Open for questions? Yes, please. How much time do we have?
5.
5? Okay. So we'll take 3 questions. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, this is not for the panel.
Yeah.
It's for all of us. What they said was so important about us all being part of history, but I find that we tend to listen to this and then walk away and throw out our grandmother's diaries. We destroy evidence. We tear up old notebooks. We throw out old account diaries that our grandmothers have. Please don't do that. And please, if you have an old person in your family, a mother, a grandma, sit with them and record them. Because that will one day be what the grandson of Professor Venkatachalapathy or of Professor Kanisetti will be looking at as evidence.
When you think of where to give it, Archives of Contemporary India, Ashoka University. You can find me. I'm extremely serious. Thank you.
So thank you. That was an excellent session. And I wanted to make a comment and then also maybe raise a more existential question. One, of course, is the point that you made about the written history, which was, associated with some of the priestly or the royalty and so on, and what we don't know about so many of the other communities. And that is something that I've also grappled with because I come in from the technology side and having worked on Chola bronzes and so on. I'm Sharda Srinivasan, where I was really trying to, for instance, some of the inscriptions like Sendi and Mahadevi mentions in the 10th century about the Kamalar, who were a community of bronze workers. But so when you try to compare, the bronze working technology, for instance, in Swami Malay and so on, there isn't really that much in the inscriptions, and then it's from the analysis that you really piece it. And in fact, I should mention here, because, the Nilgiris, we also have a photo exhibition where some of us have contributed, and there's also a book that was brought out. And I'd done some work on the Nilgiri metallurgy, and, almost nobody knows about the fact that right here in the Nilgiris, you have some really amazing metallurgical traditions. Some of the earliest, proper gold jewelry that has been, found anywhere in the subcontinent which survives. Of course, some of it is in the, British Museum and so on. And these astonishing heightened bronzes, because even though we think they're really megalithic cultures, these are really skilled bronzes which are still being made by these commanders. Yes, so the point is, of course, that, what I really think is great, that as public historians, bringing to light, or which all of you have been doing, that's wonderful. But, the complexity for, let's say, academic historians is, history, you can't make categorical statements. And I constantly find that when I'm up on a stage, people say, so tell me, when was the earliest this made and earliest that made? So these nuances, you get trapped when you're, and now we see that more and more with internet and Facebook, and people are making all sorts of wild and categorical statements about everything. Some things are made by aliens, and, so we're really in a very complicated situation, and, and we also need to really record more of the oral histories of these communities, like right here in the Nilgiris and the languages. So how do we navigate all this? I'd like.
Please keep your questions short.
I just want to respond very briefly. I'm very happy to know that I've never seen Dr. Sharda Srinivasan, but I heard so much about her work. What I want to underline is history is a discipline. It requires training. It requires training in a variety of fields. But now, in this day of social media, anybody can pass off as a historian. So when we say that we want to write accessible histories, we mean that based on sound technical knowledge in the fields that we work. People walk up to me and said, what do you think about Kirari? I said, I'm a modern historian. I'm interested in ancient history. I read Sangam poetry. But I'm not going to say anything about Kirari. But they want to take words out of your mouth. So once again, I underline this. You need to be trained, but doesn't mean that history should be written only by certain trained people. Anybody can acquire that training. You can acquire that training, and history can be written, but don't try without the training.
So can I just add to it? I had a relative who told me it is very unfortunate that I studied history and not physics. So I said I couldn't have studied physics. I managed to fail in it. So I asked him, what's the difference? He said, physics is a science. History is arts. So I said, what's the difference? He said, oh, didn't you know that? Science, he said, is about explanation. Arts is just description. So I said, no. I'll tell you something. I suggested to him, he read A.N. Whitehead, who wrote, history and the humanistic sciences may be about description, but the description contains within itself an explanation. It is very critical to explain in today's world that the humanistic disciplines, of which history is a part, have a method. The method is implicit. It doesn't mean there is no method. I want to emphasize that there is a method. And I'm saying this because I was very struck whenever there are questions asked of scientists. They are, how did you get to this? When it's of a historian, it is, what's the answer? But there is a method of questioning in the humanistic disciplines, and in the historical discipline, it's more complicated because of how you look at evidence at a time when people conceive the things differently, and the material evidence, Professor Srinivasan, is so critical. It can tell us things which the written evidence can't. It's also the history of artifacts, which we've, you have raised it to a new level, of course, in your own popular writing, but it's something we're increasingly coming to terms with, what people ate, what they produce, what metals they use, what leather they use. It can tell us as much as the text can. Thanks.
Any more questions? Okay.
Yeah, lots of Deccan of the, which is in the covers in the medieval period. Okay, and Buddhism, Jainism once flourished in India, and it declined. Actually, you can see even Buddhist, Jainist poets in Tamil, like Thiruvalluvar was a Jain. Like it was such a popular religion. I just want to know how it declined or how it disappeared in India. And especially, I think in the medieval period, it got disappeared. And whereas China or in Sri Lanka or in some other places where the Buddhism was able to flourish, but in India, it entirely got disappeared. I just would like to hear from you. Thank you.
So what Dr. Rangarajan was just talking about, in that we're kind of expected to have a definitive answer, but we don't actually know exactly what happened because of the lack of evidence and the fact that very often history is written by the victors. I do want to point out, though, that it's even though the narrative is that Buddhism and Jainism disappeared, the answer is that in a lot of cases they actually survived well into the modern day. They just did not have the political patronage that kept them at the center stage. So if you look at Jainism, especially in coastal Karnataka, that comes in an unbroken line straight from the medieval period. It never really died out in Karnataka. Buddhism also, as late as the 1600s, there are inscriptions showing that at Amaravati, in the Andhra coast, there were major Buddhist sites, and there were rulers who, even if they were not Buddhists, were still patronizing Buddhist establishments. So we have to be very careful in terms of when we say extinction, we're really talking about it disappearing from courtly patronage. That doesn't mean that it does not exist. It just means you have to look a little harder for it. Now, in terms of why it lost courtly patronage, that's a question that we don't really have an answer to. I think a big part of it is that, ritually speaking, like a big part of why religion attained courtly patronage was in terms of the ritual apparatus it offered to the rulers. So one thing that medieval Shaivism does very well is that it offers these extraordinary rituals for bringing rain, ensuring success in war, and we see the Buddhists also beginning to imitate that, but increasingly, especially in medieval Tamil Buddhism, it becomes very, very similar to Shaivism. So there have been these archaeological excavations in Nagapattinam that show that Buddhists were also establishing Nondavilakku, these eternal lamps for the Buddha. They are also offering flowers. They're also doing a lot of things that are very similar to Shaivism. So the boundaries are really beginning to blur. And at some point, it seems that because of the dominance perhaps of Shaiva priests and of Shaiva ritual sites and so on, at some point the Buddhists were just slowly elbowed out and then disappeared. To your point about Tamil Jains especially, Thiruvalluvar and so many of their manuscripts were maintained by Tamil Jain communities and then attained mainstream recognition once again when I think it was Brahmins who rediscovered them and then edited and published
Can
them.
I add a story
Please,
to it,
please.
It'd be appropriate to end with that. So we say that Jainism disappeared. So in the 1880s, Swaminatha Iyer was struggling with this Jain text Sivak Sindhamani. He's struggling, he doesn't understand, he can't make out the difference between Jainism and Buddhism. Right at the time when he's struggling with it, 2 streets from his home, a complete recital of that Sivak Sindhamani is going on. Exactly at the time when, the colleges and the institutions are talking of the extinction of a text, you find that text is actually living. And to add one more thing to it, he runs into a term called Bhavya Jivan. He can't understand it. The professors in his Kumbakonam college are not able to explain what that means. It is an old Jain woman living in Kumbakonam, 2 streets from his home, who explains to him what Bhavya Jivan means. So this is India. There are what traditions which we believe have actually passed away, died out. You actually find that they are living. So this, for us to look, we have to look for it.
Just
just
because
want
something
to-
is not recorded doesn't mean that it's dead.
I just want to add, we are assuming that X is Jain, X is Hindu, something you know very well. Mahatma Gandhi's mother belonged to a Pranami sect. The Pranami sect is extraordinary. This is in the autobiography, that you recite the name of Krishna, but in a room where Bismillah is written on the walls. What is she? Technically, she's a Mohd Baniya. But is she only a Mohd Baniya? No, she's someone who also sits and worships in a room where, Allah is, the word Bismillah is on the walls, and for her, Bismillah has some significance. So I think we should keep in mind, identities may be much more fluid at the time we are studying, and even in our own time. The idea of making identities rigid is itself a deeply political project. I'm not suggesting the other isn't, but we should be very, very careful about this. And you do know there are 2 easy answers to your question. Nehru was of the view that Brahmanism absorbed Buddhism. Ambedkar was of the view that Brahmanism, particularly led by rulers, smashed Buddhism. Obviously, the truth may be more complicated than either. And that, I think, is the point. If you ask a historian a question, they'll say 2 things. The answer is longer than you expect, and it's more complicated than you thought. So I think it is. Thank you.
And historians never end sessions in time.